Taxation is theft. The average business owner in the United States loses more than half of their income each and every year to taxes. I refer to this as the journey of the dollar and the 5 erosions. Walk with me as I explain what this journey is, how it came about in the first place, and ultimately what you can do to plug what tends to be the largest profit leak for most business owners. The history of taxation in the United States is quite complex, and we're going to dive deeper into what the tax code is and how it evolved. But before we do that, I need to help you better understand the journey of a dollar. You see, imagine for a moment that you go out into the marketplace and you actually exchange your time, effort, and energy for a trade. Maybe it's your business, maybe it's a product that you're selling, maybe you're a W-2 earner. But regardless, when you earn that dollar, what are they going to do with it? That's right, they're going to tax it. It's called an income tax. Not only do you get taxed on the dollar you earn, when you take that taxed dollar and go out into the marketplace yourself and exchange that dollar for a good or service that you want, what are they going to do there? That's right, they're going to tax that as well. It's called a sales tax. Not only that, but let's assume that the thing you purchase, it accumulates in value over time, and you are interested then to sell that thing that you purchased. Well, what are they going to do then? That's right, they're going to tax that as well. It's called a capital gains tax. And there are certain things that you go out and buy and spend money on, and even if you're just holding on to them, what do? That's right, they tax that too. It's referred to as a property tax. Here's the final nail in the coffin, pun intended. What happens if you go out into the world and you accumulate real wealth? You spend all of your effort and energy creating valuable skills within yourself that you can trade with the marketplace and have them exchange their dollars for the value that you bring to the world. That accumulation of wealth is something truly to be proud of, but here's the final nail. They're going to tax that too. It's referred to as an inheritance or an estate tax. You see, taxation runs through the entirety of the journey of the dollar. And if you really want to take this perspective and do a true inception on it, just imagine how each iteration of that dollar exchanging hands from one participant in the marketplace to another, at every exchange, it is taxed for that new participant. This is the nature of taxation, and this is why I consider it to be theft. I know this sounds depressing, but there is actually a solution specifically for business owners out there. Before we do that, though, I need you to understand how this came about in the first place, because that's the foundation that's necessary for the solution to be even present. I know that there are going to be a number of haters that may jump into the comment section saying, Edward, what are you trying to do? Get out of your fair share of taxes? Well, here's the reality. Whose definition of fair are we talking about? Is it yours or is it mine? You see, at the end of the day, I respect that taxation is a component of a well-functioning society. I just have a problem with all of the corruption and the waste and the challenge that exists within our system today. But in order to really understand how it evolved, let's take a look at the history of the tax code. For much of the early history of the United States, there was actually no income taxation at all. In fact, the entirety of the federal government operated and was funded exclusively by tariffs and excise taxes. It wasn't until the Civil War that we actually saw the introduction of the very first income tax. Congress, in all its glory, passed something called the Revenue Act of 1862, and that introduced the very first income tax in the United States. But it was quickly repealed as soon as the war was over. In 1872, so many people were arguing that this particular tax was unconstitutional that Congress essentially said, okay, our bad, let's take it back. But you see, Congress actually got addicted to the concept of free money. In 1894, they passed something referred to as the Wilson-Gorman Tariff Act, and that reintroduced an income tax in the United States. But the problem is so many people had a challenge with it and even challenged it in court. Those court cases made it all the way to the Supreme Court the very next year. In 1895, the Supreme Court struck down this act, determining that it was truly unconstitutional. Seeing the pattern here? You see, Congress was also starting to pick up on the pattern here. Every time that they were introducing an income tax on individual income, they were getting challenged in the court. And they tried to come up with a way that they could actually still tax people, but without actually taxing the people. So they came up with this idea, this concept in 1909, and they introduced something called the corporate excise tax, which was a tax on corporate profit, 1% tax on all profits over $5,000. This was Congress's way of sort of circumventing the challenge that they were constantly getting with regard to having an income tax on individual income. They were essentially saying who's making the income, who's making substantial profit, and they targeted essentially those larger corporations, those larger businesses, because it was a way to sort of circumvent the opportunity of trying to get money from individual citizens. Now, this corporate excise tax tax was a really good first step for them to be able to have strong footing. Why? Because Congress already had well established its ability to regulate commerce. So adding a tax on business activity, that was pretty much an easy thing for them to introduce. But here's the challenge. It wasn't enough. They were still hungry for more. So imagine for the moment that you are a member of Congress. This is the early 1900s, and you're recognizing that time and time again, when you try to introduce an income tax on individual citizens, you're being fought in the courts. And every time, you're losing. So what do? Well, that's when you start trying to come up with a methodology for getting around the entire unconstitutional nature of income tax by trying to make it constitutional in the first place. You see, that's what Congress actually did. They started going out to the different states. They started promoting and proselytizing the fact that the income tax is the solution to all of our problems. That's ultimately what they did. And the way they went out to the states, the type of methodology that they used to try to convince the states to agree with them, is they said, hey, listen, you don't have to worry, because any type of income tax that we put into effect, it's only going to be temporary. How's that worked out for us? You see, in 1913, they actually convinced enough of the states to agree that they passed the 16th Amendment to the Constitution, which finally gave Congress the constitutional strength to be able to go out and tax the income of individual citizens. You see, the problem here is, though, that the federal government is absolutely addicted to free money. Don't get me wrong, Congress is sitting back and they're relaxing at this point because they're so happy that they're able to tax individual income without it being challenged as unconstitutional in the courts now. The problem is that the government itself is just not satisfied. They want more. And in 1935, Franklin D. Roosevelt, he introduced something called the Social Security Act. And this was designed to be the very first payroll tax to essentially support all of the social programs that were now being introduced in the wake of the Great Depression. Don't get me wrong, there are significant benefits to social programs, but when the system itself is rampant with corruption and challenged with regard to actually monitoring and managing the resources that the government's collecting, well, this just becomes a whole ridiculous empty black hole where these resources are being reallocated to some people's pockets that they shouldn't be. So enter the Revenue Act of 1942. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, he actually needed more money because now we had to support World War II. And with that Revenue Act of 1942, he dramatically increased the actual income taxes being collected because he raised income tax rates and he lowered the thresholds by which those rates became effective. And not only that, he introduced now a regular tax withholding and payment system, specifically on at least a quarterly basis. And this is where a lot of business owners can chime in and say, hey, listen, I totally understand what's happening here because I, as a business owner, am being forced to pay my taxes at least on a quarterly basis. Otherwise, I end up paying ridiculous penalties. You see, payroll taxes, though, didn't stop there. In fact, in 1965, Lyndon Johnson introduced something called the Medicare Act. And that was an additional payroll tax designed to provide some financial safety net to aging Americans, specifically those individuals over the age of 65. Combined, the way the Social Security and Medicare Act work today, well, it's the dreaded F word when it comes to taxes. What the FICA? And from 1965 to today, the actual infrastructure of the tax code has not really evolved much. There have been significant changes to things like tax rates and the effective income thresholds by which those rates are applicable, but the infrastructure itself is primarily the same. Now, here's the reality, though. If you do look at where we are today, we are at historically low income tax rates. You see, if you look at the landscape of taxation throughout history, the history that I just shared with you, income tax rates for the majority of the time have actually been higher than where they are today. And with all of the absolute ridiculousness of government spending that's been happening over these past number of years, how could you argue with me that income tax rates aren't going to be going up from here? If you believe that they are going to be significantly higher down the road, now is the time to be planning. Because if you don't start to plan today, you're setting yourself up for a disaster down the road. But what does it mean to plan? It all starts with understanding that the tax code itself is essentially a recipe book. Before we can jump into the concept of the recipe book itself, we first have to understand the fact that there are actually two different purposes behind the tax code. You see, the tax code itself, purpose number one, is the one we already know. It's to raise revenue for the operations of the government. But that's not the most important purpose. See, I'm a lawyer. I specialize in tax, estate, and business law. And when I dive deep into the tax code, I start to uncover and realize that the true purpose, the driving force behind the tax code, is it's designed to incentivize action or inaction amongst the people here in the US. When you understand that it's designed to get you to do things or not to do things, that starts to paint a whole new picture for you to understand the recipe book itself. So in order to dive deep into the recipe book itself, you need to understand it in the context of pretty much any other recipe that exists, right? Imagine for the moment that you're interested in baking a cake. Not only do you need all the ingredients, but you also need the utensils, the pots and pans, the oven, and you need to be able to put everything in the right order at the right time to get the outcome you desire, which is the cake. If you like this concept and you'd love to dive into this and other topics that can move the needle for you in much more detail, you're probably going to want to jump into my private membership community. It's called UpLevel, and in there we get together and gather business owners of all different stages of their entrepreneurial journey from all over the country, and we dive deep into the concepts and to the strategies that can actually make a difference for you. If you're interested in learning much more about that, check out the link in the description below.